and welcome to Walking the Virtual Dog. So, this is the show where we take a moment, take our virtual dogs for a walk, and think about what we're seeing in the IT industry from the lens and the perspective of the IT analyst. I'm your host, Rick Grant, but to make sense of all of this, we have Thomas Ward Lynch. He's a veteran industry analyst, practitioner, and he joins us now. Tom, thanks for being here.
Thank you. We're going to need some coffee to get through this section because now we're going to get into the heavy stuff. It's interesting and it's fun to take a look at what's happening in the PC and the workstation world because everybody uses them, right? It's a common investment for the IT departments to make for their companies. It's also a common investment for us all to make for our homes. In fact, and I didn't include this in the other discussion, but it's kind of fun. As we all know, within the last 2 weeks, India is now the most populated country in the world, right? Surpassing China. That all made the news. Also, what made the news was Apple's opened their very first store in India. So, voila, there's a whole new access to a whole new market. So it's fun stuff to talk about this, but you know what? Sometimes we've got to get into the heavier stuff, and the heavier stuff is what happens in the IT data centers. In other words, the mid-range servers, the mainframe servers, the PCX, the 486 servers, x86 servers, as we like to say. Those are the things that come up, right, in terms of much more heavier spend. So it's important for us to take a look at what those reports are saying from the IT analyst community. So we're going to drill down a little bit on an article that was written by Timothy Pritchett Morgan. Timothy Pritchett Morgan is writing for a publication called The IT Jungle, and it's a section of the IT Jungle called the 400. Now, the 400 is a nod to mid-range servers. AS400 is a predecessor name of the brand from IBM, which is now known as Power. At one time, there was an AS400 and RS6000 lines. Those lines have been merged years ago, but it's a nod to that because so many data centers are still running on operating systems that started with all the way back into the AS400, which is now the IBM I. Incidentally, for all of the users out there that are listening to this broadcast who are in the field of studying and looking at how they can sharpen their IBM I training, I would strongly suggest that you look to the IT Jungle because they have some incredibly informative sections for everyone to take a look at in terms of new training that's coming up from IBM to sharpen those skills and to leverage that operating system as much as possible. But getting back to the article itself was the downshifting of IT spending growth continues apace. And again, this came from Timothy Pritchett Morgan, but it's about what's happening in terms of the data center. Where's the spend going? Now, to give a little bit of context, and you're seeing a quote on the screen, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But the truth is that whenever we take a look at this report, he goes into great detail. And the important thing to point out here is there is an increase. However, it's been adjusted in terms of forecast by IDC to not be as high as it was previously. And that's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing because, again, you're going to see the graphs in a minute that show this is a steady increase. It's just not going at lightning speed in an increase. So here's a little bit of an excerpt from the article itself from Morgan. Back in October of 2022, IDC reckoned that the global market for IT hardware and software services would rise by 6% in 2023 when gauged in the US dollars, up 5.2% in constant currencies where countries don't use the US dollar. So again, this is a worldwide report. We're not looking at just the US or just Europe. We're looking all the way across the board. The growth rate in worldwide IT spending is now down to 4.4% growth. In other words, it's a controlled growth. Makes sense. In the April 2023 forecast for this year, with sales of IT products rising to 3.25 trillion. This figure includes spending on PCs, which have been plummeting, but now IDC is figuring that companies are going to cut back on server spending. So in other words, they're going to cut back on the x86 spending. They're going to cut back on the mid-range spending. Again, there's going to be growth, but it's not going to be dramatic growth, all right? As well as on wearables and peripherals. So we kind of expected that already because we're already seeing the charts that are pointing that out. So let's take a look at Steve Minton's quote that you brought up a couple of times now. Now, this is from the vice president of IDC, and he's involved in the data and analytics research group. Resellers that still derive much of their revenue from on-premise infrastructure and PCs are facing difficult market conditions this year. Meanwhile, cloud infrastructure, software, and services are growing more slowly than a year ago, but continue to account for a larger share of the total IT spending. So we're beginning to see other pieces of that pie, Rick. It's coming apart for us so we can actually take a look at where the spending is going and where the directions are going. Now you might say to yourself, well, if I'm a data guy and I'm in the data center and I've got the budget and I'm spending it the way I need to spend it and so forth. Here's what's important for you to know. It's important for you to take a look at these numbers to understand what your competitors are doing. Are they in fact are you in pace with everyone else? Did you put off the x86 server spend that you should have done already? Are you end of life or are you out of support or out of service on your mid-range servers? How about your storage? Has that been covered? Basically, what these reports are indicating to us as we take a look at the perspective is a lot of the spend has already happened. So that your competitors have already made those investments and they've already moved forward. Let's go back to the quote and finish that, and then we'll go on and take a look at the chart that Morgan put in his article. More slowly than a year ago, but continue to account for a larger share of the IT spending and are reinforcing the general sense of resilience in which the industry still enjoys. And again, that's from Stephen Minton. If we take a look at the next slide, you'll see the chart that shows this is a worldwide perspective. Now, this came from Morgan's article, but it is research done by IDC, and you can get a feel for how things are not, again, dropping off and dramatic like we saw in an earlier segment whenever we took a look at PC sales worldwide in the first quarter, right? Essentially, we're seeing continued growth, continued increase. We're just not seeing dramatic changes that we see in the other sectors of the business. Now, let's go back to what Stephen Minton had to say. We don't have to look at the chart. But here's the important piece to get from it. That is, money is being spent, absolutely. Increases in budgets are happening, absolutely. But what about this cloud infrastructure? What exactly is that? And whenever we say cloud, unfortunately, in the business, it's a very vague term. It can mean software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. And all of those things we still need to break down, Rick, in our next segment.
All right, Thomas, it's becoming your usual way. You're keeping us waiting for the good stuff, although everything
Well, this is all good stuff. It's actually fun, you know. I mean, a lot of us kicked off our careers in the PC and the workstation and the peer networking environment, and then we went on to network servers, and then we got into more and more sophisticated computing power in the data center. The fact of the matter is, as we look at these charts, if we're looking at folks that have stalled on their investment, they need to go ahead and take care of that investment so they can move on to the more sophisticated investments that are coming.
All right, Thomas, we'll pick that up next time on Walking the Virtual Dog.